there's massive needs for those basic provisions. They're saying it's going to take 80 years. The UN said 80 years to rebuild the housing units.
Tens of thousands of people are queuing to get back into northern Gaza today. In a few minutes, we'll talk more about what kind of damage they'll find when they get there and how long it might take to rebuild. 7 Israeli hostages and just under 300 Palestinian prisoners have been released since the ceasefire deal came into force, and 3 more Israeli hostages are due to be freed on Thursday. Does the ceasefire deal seem to be more on solid ground day by day? Tal Schneider is the political and diplomatic correspondent for the Times of Israel and joins me now. Hi, Tal.
Hi, good afternoon.
So tens of thousands of people are returning to northern Gaza. Just talk us through what the logistics are. There are 2 ways in.
Israel military IDF pulled out from a narrow strip close to the beach area, between the beach and kind of a midway, the entire area is very, very narrow. So they pulled out just from this corridor, taking IDF back a little bit and allowing the people to walk free on their foot from the southern part to the northern area of Gaza, basically to the area of Gaza City, which was the capital of Gaza. And we're seeing a big flow, I think tens of thousands of people, but it's probably, we think that there is at least 1 million that moved down south. So we don't see the entire million going back already. And as you said, the ceasefire agreement will see more hostages coming out on this Thursday, 2 women and probably one of the elderly. And then on Saturday morning, we're going to see additional group of 3. This will be the first time that we will see the men that were captive taken out. Up until now, we saw only women and kids. If you recall last year and this year, up until now, there was only women. And so this is what we'll see on Thursday.
And of the 3 more Israeli hostages who are due to be handed over on Thursday, do you have anything else you can tell us about them? What do we know?
So one is Arbel Yahud. He was kidnapped from the kibbutz near the border, a civilian, 28 years old, very young woman. And the other one is the last women soldier, 19-year-old Agam Berger. And the third might be, I'm not sure about that because it's not announced yet, but might be the 64 years old Kate Siegel, also from the kibbutz near the border, and also an American citizen. So his wife was taken also hostages, and she was released a year ago, more than a year ago, and he remained in a very dire condition. We saw a video of him crying his heart out and really difficult things to see. And we hope that he's, well and can be out soon this Thursday. And then on Saturday, we might see 3 more men. Some of them lost, some of the men lost their wife who were murdered in front of their eyes. And all of them are above the age of 50. And some lost their, kids. At least one that I know lost his kid, an 18-year-old young woman who was murdered in front of his eyes. So very difficult situations. And I can't tell you, how they will be out and what their business situation with them.
Indeed, it's extremely difficult. And can I also ask you about the comments from President Trump at the weekend that he said, you're talking about probably 1.5 million people and we just need to clean out that whole thing. How are people reacting to that comment from the president?
Yeah, so Israeli government is probably delighted, I suppose, with that. Not all of the government, but the extreme part of the government are delighted. They said it already. But overall, this is unrealistic scam, unrealistic plan. As a correspondent, I talked to Middle Eastern diplomats from Arab countries, a neighboring country that have peace with Israel. For the Egyptian, for example, releasing 1 million people into Egypt, it's like a declaration of war. It's never going to happen. It's so obvious. They will never agree to that. They've been telling that over and over again in the last year. It's out of the question. For the Jordanian, it can actually risk their monarchy. It can cause upheaval in the country. They have a problem to deal with the Palestinians that they have already for 70 years. It's a huge group that, they're not dealing with them pretty good. And I don't think this is like total, it's like to put a threat on a country, and those 2 countries will never agree to that. So, where else? If you, did the American president suggest that he can put the people, 1 million people on planes and bring them in the United States? I don't think so. So it seems to me like just kind of a handcuffed comment that came out without too much of preparation. And even with some Israeli cheering this idea, I really think I mean, you cannot just move people, like 1 million people, 2 million people. I think, by the way, there is 2.3 million people in there. It's almost impossible to just, it's not a basket that you can move from one place to another.
And it certainly is something that we had not a huge amount of detail from the president on, I think it's fair to say. Before I let you go, can I ask you about the United Nations report that estimated by the end of January that the conflict had inflicted £18.5 billion worth of damage on Gaza's infrastructure? Do we have any sense of how that might be paid for?
No, we do not. The big problem is none of the donation countries, such as Saudi Arabia, Emirates, and other countries in the region, they keep on saying, we will not pay a dime as long as there is a terror organization controlling this place. So as long as the Hamas is in power, and it is in power still, you will see a huge problem for any country or any worldwide organization to bring in the money to help them. So there are civilians in there, but this was the big dilemma with the humanitarian aid. Israel brought in humanitarian aid with the request and push of many international community of countries. They brought in a lot of humanitarian aid. But this humanitarian aid went right into the hands of the terror organization, who is, putting the huge price on the goods, and the people are still starving. And by the way, it's also an Israeli fault, because Israel did not work to bring in another solution, strategic solution. So I'm not blaming just the Palestinians. I think that Israel did wrong with that. But when you want to take it up from just humanitarian aid for just food to feed the people into reconstruction, you hear from around the world, we're not going to do that as long as there's a terror organization ruling this place. It just doesn't make sense, because they're going to use the concrete to build more tunnels, to build more terror. That's what they did with the money before the war. So how? I mean, we don't see the end to that.
Tal Schneider, political diplomatic correspondent for The Times of Israel, thank you very much for joining us. Now, many Palestinians will leave their tent camps to return to rubble, sparking questions about how Gaza now rebuilds. Let's bring in Chris Rose, who's a director at Amos Trust, a human rights organisation that works with grassroots projects in Gaza and the West Bank. Hi, Chris.
Hi, nice to be with you.
So what's the situation like on the ground?
It's beyond words. I mean, it's described as a genocide, and we would go along with that. Because it's such a complete attack on every part of the infrastructure and the whole of society. You've got 92% of housing units have been destroyed or damaged. Up in the north, that's 82% of housing units are destroyed. You've got 85% of schools destroyed or damaged, all universities, 200 mosques, etc., etc. You've got virtually no sewage work, no waterworks. You've got just massive devastation. And so you've got people who are surviving with piles of rubble. I mean, 50 million tons of rubble, let alone all the solid waste, sewage, all these things. So it's just absolute chaos on the ground and awful, awful conditions. Everybody who goes in says the thing you can't describe of it is the smell, because it's really visceral. And so it's an awful, awful situation people face there.
And how do you even begin to rebuild?
The start of all is aid must flow in, first of all. There must be aid. People must be able to, at the moment, there's a massive shortage of blankets and tents for Gaza City as people are returning north to try to go back to homes, to try to find people lost in the rubble, to see what's left. There's massive needs for those basic provisions. They're saying it's going to take 80 years. The UN said 80 years to rebuild the housing units. And it has to start with infrastructure. It has to start with water supplies. It has to start with desalination units, with those basic infrastructure things, electricity, getting rid of the sewage, getting rid of the rubble. You've got 50 million tons of rubble. And that's a load of that is contaminated with body parts, also with white phosphorus at times, and radiated shells because reports of those being used. So you have all this stuff there. So it's just an unbelievably big challenge ahead for people. And in addition to that, you've got to work out what you're going to do with 7,500 tons of unexploded ordnance, which that alone they're saying could take 15 years to sort out. So it really is a monumental task ahead of people.
And of those priorities that you just listed, is there a plan in place for the order in which the authorities are going to begin to do that? How is the plan in place at the moment to try and make sure that some of those things are tackled?
I mean, it's so dependent on, to be honest, it's so dependent on what Israel allows in as well. The authorities there are not in charge of what happens in that respect. It's about, as was mentioned, about what aid is allowed in. And Israel will have major concerns about allowing concrete and cement in, and a number of those things. And so there's, and we'll are very likely to put restrictions on what comes in. So there's just massive challenges as to how you start with that. And there has to be a real system put in place to enable rebuilding to occur.
And long-term money for this could come from governments and businesses rather than perhaps charities. How far away does that kind of prospect seem to you at the moment?
I think it's a couple of things. First of all, there's got to be a long-term resolution for Palestinians. Shipping out a population from their homes and saying that's the answer can never be that. There has to be a long-term solution, and that ultimately has to be that there's got to be open borders and that people are able to trade. It's a highly entrepreneurial society. And so you need to be in a situation where that can occur. That's a long, long way away from it at the moment. But until there's some real diplomatic moves and some real moves to some long-term opportunities for Palestinians, it's just going to rely on aid. And as we've seen with previous things, you rebuild and then it's destroyed again in the latest round of conflict. And so there has to be some real steps to meet the Palestinians' legitimate demands for some sort of state, some sort of meaningful future.
And from David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, what would you like to see in the immediate term?
Personally, I'd like to see, I believe we still need an arms embargo against Israel. I'd like to see the implementation of international law, whether that's in the West Bank or Gaza. I think there needs to be full examination of the war crimes committed, whether that be by Hamas or by the Israeli Defense Forces. So I think those things need to be looked at, and there needs to be some accountability for what's happened.
Sorry, Chris, we'll have to end it there, but thank you very much for joining us. That was Chris Rose from the charity Amos Trust.